Okay, this lecture is a continuation of the previous, which is reviewing experiments with more than one IV, also known as factorial designs. And so what I'm going to review in this lecture are different variations on factorial designs. So I'll briefly review independent groups factorial designs, which are otherwise known as between groups factorial designs. So I will often kind of oscillate back and forth between saying independent groups versus between groups. They're the same thing, okay? So just be kind of flexible in your brain because in in um, in research in the world, these are used independently. So independent groups, between groups, same thing. Okay. Also review within group factorial designs, mixed factorial designs. Look at how the reasons for increasing the number of levels of an independent variable and how that affects the different research questions that can be asked and the different statistical effects that can be analyzed. And then also increasing the number of independent variables, again, looking at research questions and the statistical effects that can be picked out. So, in independent groups factorial design, otherwise known as a between groups factorial design, is when both independent variables are manipulated between groups. So if the design is a 2 by 2 independent groups factorial design, that means that you have 4 different groups of participants. And kind of in the language of factorial designs, we can say that there would be 4 cells in the design that would represent 4 different treatment conditions or 4 different treatments of the study or the experiment. Okay. So again, it's often known as a between subjects factorial design because all of the manipulation of the independent variable happens between subjects. Okay. So just to contrast with an independent groups, we can have a within groups design. So in a within groups design, otherwise known as repeated measures factorial designs, both of the independent variables are manipulated within groups. Okay, so if we have in this case, we've got a 2 by 2 design, and so we can look at a 2 by 2 design that would be an independent groups design. In this case, we've got 48 different participants because in each of the 4 cells of the design, we've got 12 different people in each cell. Okay, so this first variable, I forget what this was from the chapter, but let's just say we've got one variable, which is the type of photo that they view, and there's either an alcohol photo or a plant photo, and then in another condition of the experiment, they're exposed to different words, neutral words, and aggression-related words. So we've got a photo variable, a word variable, 2 levels of each. So we've got basically a 2 by 2 design. So 2 levels of each variable, so we've got 4 different cells. In a between groups or independent groups design, if you wanted to put 12 people in each condition, you'd need 48. Within groups, those same 12 participants would be exposed to all levels of all IVs. Okay, so what you'd have is that in the 4 cells of the design, all 12 people participate in all 4 cells. So all 12 people receive both levels of the photo variable and receive all levels of the word type variable. So you can see that really within groups designs are the most efficient in terms of the number of participants needed. And so one of the major reasons for using a within groups design is efficiency in terms of time and cost of participants. So in many research studies, you need to pay participants, and so the cost of performing the study just in terms of compensation to participants would be 1/4 the amount in this particular design. There's of course other reasons that I've previously lectured on to use it within the groups design, which has to do with statistical power reasons. And this is because each participant serves as their own control. So there are statistical power advantages as well, because by having a within groups design, we reduce the amount of variability found within each cell. And so that's a more powerful statistical design. It's also possible to use a kind of a combination of the two. So in a mixed factorial design, one independent variable is manipulated as independent or between groups, the other is manipulated within groups. And we can say that this design is intermediate between the within groups and independent groups design in terms of the number of participants. So let's just add a mixed design to our example here. We've got the same 2x2 design where we've got photo type as well as word type. In this case, the photo type is the between group variable. So you'll notice that we've got participants 1 through 12 in the alcohol photo condition, and then participants 13 through 24 in the plant photo. The word type is the within groups or within subjects variable. So the first 12 people receive both levels of that variable. They participate in the neutral word condition as well as the aggression related word example. Okay, so again, this is really seen as an intermediate, and indeed the number of participants needed for this design is right in the middle of, well, not right in the middle, but it's between the independent groups design and the within groups design. Okay. It's also possible to add more levels. So we've been using relatively simple examples where we've had 2 variables and then only 2 levels of each variable. So really a 2x2 factorial design is the most basic or the simplest example of a factorial design. But to investigate more complicated research questions, to test generalizability of effects, or whatever the motivation is, researchers can add more levels to their IVs. And so recall from the previous lecture, we were looking at the study in which researchers used a factorial design to look at the effect of using a cell phone as well as the age of a driver on different types of driving performance. In this case, we've got the time that it takes to brake. So previously, in the previous example, the researchers had created a 2x2 design because in the cell phone condition, they either used a hands-free cell phone or they didn't. So it was either cell phone or not. The second variable was driver's age, with young drivers and old drivers. It would be possible to add another level, for example, to cell phone condition. So in the original study, it was hands-free cell phone versus no phone. What if they wanted to look at the effect of, does it matter if we have a handheld versus a hands-free? And indeed, there's some laws and legislation that say, okay, it's okay to use a cell phone, but it can't be a handheld. It has to be hands-free. Okay, so that would involve adding a third level to the cell phone condition. So that would turn the 2x2 factorial design into a 3x2 factorial design, okay, where we've got 3 to represent the number of levels of the first independent variable. Okay, notice this would also change the number of cells. Previously, there was 4 cells in the design. There are now 6 cells in the design, okay, depicted by our 6 cells here. And again, you could, or a researcher could have a completely between groups design, or could have a mixed design. In this case, it would either need to be a between or a mixed, because we can't have both young drivers and old drivers participate in both levels of this IV, because this is a participant variable, it's not a manipulated variable, okay? So the 2 different options in this particular research study would be to use a completely between subjects design, where you've got different participants in each of these 6 cells, Or they could use a mixed design where young drivers participate in all three conditions of the cell phone condition and old drivers participate in all three conditions of the cell phone condition. Okay. In terms of notation, the way that we designate the research design is using basically by using this type of notation. And so we've got, in the first case, a 2x2 factorial design, and in the second case, a 3x2 factorial design. That we have two numbers separated by the x suggests that tells us the number of IVs that we have, the number of independent variables. The numbers of each tell you the number of levels of each of the IV. So in the first case, in the 2x2 factorial, we could say that we have a cell phone by driver's age factorial design where there's two levels of each, phone, no phone, young versus old. In the 3x2 factorial design, we have 3 levels of cell phone, hands held, hands free, no phone, and then still 2 levels of driver's age. It's somewhat arbitrary whether we would call this a 3x2 or a 2x3. Previously, we had designated cell phone as IV1, and therefore I'm listing that first. So if IV1 is cell phone, we have to put that first and designate that there's 3 levels. Okay. It's possible to increase the number of levels of the IV for age as well. Okay. So let's just say we want to increase the number of levels of age from 2 to 4. So now we've got a 3x4 factorial design. Okay, so 3 levels of cell phone, 4 levels of age, a 3x4 design. Notice, though, we still just have the 2 variables. Okay, just the 2 variables. And this creates now 3 times 4 is 12 cells in the design, which again could be completely between, or it could be a mixed design. Okay. It is also possible to increase the number of independent variables in the study. So previously we've been talking about 2-way designs because there's only 2 independent variables, but it's possible to have 3-way designs in which there are 3 independent variables. Suppose in the study the researchers had decided to add a 3rd independent variable of traffic condition, and it had 2 different levels, either light traffic or heavy traffic. So now what we have, simplifying, just going back to the hands-free versus no cell phone, we've got a 2x2x2 design. Okay, so you can see that we've got 3 different variables, 2 levels. Okay, this is designating 2 levels of each variable. What if we had hands-free, hands held, and no cell phone? So what if we had 3 levels of cell phone condition? We'd have a 2x3x2. Okay. In this particular case, in our 2x2x2, we've got 8 cells in the design. Okay, so we can just count up those cells in the design. So 8 different, you can think of treatments. Of course, because we have a participant variable, it's not completely accurate to say that we have a treatment, but we've got 8 different conditions of the experiment. Okay, and then the motivation for adding another variable is really the same motivations for doing a factorial design in the first place. Is we want to be able to test theories, and we want to be able to test the generality of effects. So in this case, what the researchers are saying is, what is the effect of using a hands-free cell phone versus not using one? And is the effect of hands-free versus no cell phone the same or different for young versus old drivers? And then furthermore, when we look at the effect of using a hands-free cell phone versus not for young and old driver, do those effects depend on whether or not our drivers are driving in light traffic versus heavy traffic. So it's both to test, so these adding IVs and looking at the interactive effects of multiple IVs are both for testing theories as well as for establishing boundary conditions or the generalizability of effects. In this particular case, what are we seeing? We're seeing that in heavy traffic, we're seeing one, that older drivers take longer to brake than younger drivers, and that we have a relatively consistent effect of using the cell phone versus not, okay? That for both young drivers as well as old drivers, there seems to be the same increase in braking time when people have the hands-free. Notice, however, that phenomenon is different when driving in light traffic. Younger drivers, one, they brake quicker than older drivers in general, or overall, okay? But it really does depend on whether or not they're using a cell phone or not. So there's actually equivalent braking time between old and young when not using a cell phone, but when using a cell phone, older drivers brake slower, so they're affected by using the cell phone. Younger drivers are not. Okay, so what can we say is the effect of using a cell phone for young and old drivers really depends on the traffic that they're driving in. And we can say that in light traffic, young drivers, their braking time is not affected at all. Okay, in heavy traffic it is, but in light traffic it's not. Old drivers, their braking time is affected. It's slower regardless of whether they're driving in light traffic or heavy traffic. So this is really allows a researcher to study more complicated phenomenon, but to really, I mean, that's certainly something that for practical purposes you would want to know and understand as well, is, you know, what is the danger of using a cell phone? Does it depend on one's age? Does it depend on traffic? Does it depend on the combination of one's age and traffic? So that's what adding an additional independent variable allows a researcher to do. Okay, now, of course, the more independent variables are added, the more possible effects there are to pick out of the research design. So when there are 3 independent variables, as there are in this 2x2x2 design, there will be 3 possible main effects to test. So remember that a main effect is the simple overall difference of the effect of one IV that is averaged across the levels of the other IVs. So in this case, we'd be asking, let's just disregard for a moment driver age as well as the amount of traffic. Is there just an overall effect on braking time for whether people use a cell phone or not? Okay, and so this would require doing a statistical test, but we can eyeball the numbers, and let's just say for the time being, we'll treat any difference as significant, okay? We're seeing that there is an overall difference for using a cell phone versus not using a cell phone. So we would say that of the possible main effect for cell phone, there is, or there does appear to be a main effect, such that using a cell phone overall on average, okay, ignoring what their age is, ignoring what traffic conditions, we can just say overall, among all the conditions in the design, we could say that of the conditions in which the drivers used a cell phone, their onset to brake was slower than when they didn't use the cell phone. Okay, what about driver's age? We can say, okay, let's not pay attention to, for the moment, whether they're using a cell phone or not, or what type of traffic they're driving in. We just want to know, overall, on average, do older drivers take longer to brake than younger drivers? That's what we're asking for with the main effect of driver's age. And again, here too, we would have to do a statistical test to see whether this is a statistically significant difference. But just looking at the numbers on the surface and taking any difference for the time being to be significant, we'll just pretend, we would say that yes, there appears to be a main effect such that older drivers are slower to brake than younger drivers. And then we can do the same thing for traffic conditions and say, well, it seems to be the case that in heavy traffic, drivers are slower to brake than in light traffic. So yes, you'd have to do a statistical test, but the statistical test of each of these main effects would say, overall, is there an overall condition, or is there an overall difference between the levels of these variables averaging across the other independent variables? Okay. The other thing to pick out in a three-way design are interactions. So here the complexity really kind of ramps up because in a two-way design there's only one interaction. But in a three-way design there's three possible two-way interactions. Okay? So the first two-way interaction would be to look at the interaction of age by traffic. And so this is ignoring for a minute whether they're talking on the cell phone or not. So we're completely averaging across or disregarding in a way whether or not drivers are talking on a cell phone, and we're just saying, regardless of whether we're talking on a cell phone or not, does braking onset time for younger or older drivers, does the difference in braking time for younger versus older drivers depend on the traffic that they're driving in? And we would have to say, yes, we've got an example of a spreading activation here, where in light traffic, older drivers are slower to brake than younger drivers, but that's a much bigger difference in heavy traffic. So we can say that there's a bigger difference in braking onset between younger and older drivers when driving in heavy traffic versus light traffic. Okay. Another way to look at that is to say older drivers appear to be more affected by the traffic than younger drivers do. Okay. This is the example that we've then kind of had from the previous lecture. This is the original example, which is to say, let's forget about what traffic they're driving in for the time being. Is there effect of braking time? Is there a difference between younger and older drivers, and does that difference depend on whether or not they use a cell phone or not? Same thing here. It's a kind of you can think of it as a spreading interaction again. Not on the cell phone, we see a difference in braking time, but that difference is bigger. There's a bigger difference in braking time between older and younger when talking on a cell phone. Okay? And again, you would have to test statistically whether the difference between differences, which is what an interaction is, it's a difference between the differences, whether that reaches the level of statistical significance. But we can just say that, does it look like there's a possible interaction happening here? And then last one, what we're doing here is we're ignoring driver age for the time being, and we're just saying, is there a difference in braking when people talk on the cell phone or not, and does that difference depend on whether they're driving in light traffic or heavy traffic? And it appears from this graph that when talking on a cell phone, there's a difference in braking time, that overall when on the cell phone, people take longer to brake. However, the size of the difference between the no cell phone and the on the cell phone appears to be, roughly speaking, appears to be consistent. Okay, so that you brake slower on the cell phone than when not on the cell phone, but that difference in braking time is the same regardless of whether we're driving in light traffic or heavy traffic. Okay, and so again, one way to determine whether there's an interaction is to look at those lines and to say, are they parallel or would they intersect if you drew them out into space? Okay, and so these are roughly parallel. These other lines, it wouldn't be, maybe not a strong interaction, but if we continued each of these lines, we could say that they would intersect at some place. And so we can just kind of eyeball, hey, this difference looks different than this difference looks different than this difference, but this difference looks about the same as this difference. So interaction, interaction, no interaction. All right, but there's one more effect that we can pick out, which is whether there is a difference in the two-way interactions. And so in addition to the three two-way interactions, we can have a three-way interaction between variables, okay? And so if a three-way interaction is present, okay, or more specifically when tested for statistical significance, and if we find that there is a three-way interaction that is significant, it means that the two-way interactions between two of the IVs depend on the level of the third IV, okay? So the difference in differences is different, okay? It's really, this is kind of a mind blower. It hurts my brain, honestly, but this is what a three-way interaction is we're really asking, are the two-way interactions different depending on which level of the third variable we're at? Let me go over several examples that will hopefully illustrate this. This top panel, we can think about as like one study. Let's just ignore this bottom panel for a minute. So this top panel is one possible outcome that we could get. Notice that all three variables are present. We've got cell phone condition, we've got driver's age, and we've got light versus heavy traffic. What we're going to ask is, one, whether there's interactions, and whether the presence or absence of an interaction or the nature of the interaction is consistent basically on both sides of the graph. Okay? So let's first, in the light traffic condition, try to understand, does there appear to be an interaction? Well, not really. If we look at to say, is there a difference in differences, we would say that younger drivers, in this case, are slower to brake, which is kind of weird. That's been opposite of our examples, but let's not worry about it too much, okay? So younger drivers, slower to brake than older drivers, and that difference appears to be consistent, whether they're talking on a cell phone versus not. Here, what we see is basically a similar effect where we don't have an interaction here. We've got younger drivers are slower to brake than older drivers, and we've got a relatively consistent difference. So in this top graph, what we can say is that there is not a three-way interaction because there's no two-way interaction on the left and no two-way interaction on the right. What about in this bottom graph? Clearly there's interactions, right? Here we've got a crossing interaction where whether or not young drivers are slower to brake than old drivers depends on cell phone, okay? So younger drivers are slower to brake than older drivers when using a cell phone, but they're quicker to brake than older drivers when not using a cell phone when there's light traffic, okay? However, is that true when there's heavy traffic? Well, they have the same braking time. In other words, no difference. Previously, we saw differences. Here we see no difference in braking time when using a cell phone. And here we've got younger drivers being slower to brake when not on the cell phone in heavy traffic, okay? Which is a different effect than we had when not on the cell phone in light traffic. So what we can see is that there is a three-way interaction in this bottom panel because the two-way interactions are different, okay? So whether or not there is a two-way interaction and the nature of the two-way interaction depends on the level of the third variable. What about this example? Okay, this is a little tricky. Okay, here we've got, clearly have a crossover interaction on the left side. So we can say that in light traffic, when talking on the cell phone, younger drivers brake slower than older drivers, but they're quicker to brake than older drivers when not on the cell phone. And interestingly, you get that exact same pattern under heavy traffic. Younger drivers slower to brake when on the cell phone, but they're quicker to brake when not on the cell phone. So is there a three-way interaction? No, there is not in this top panel because the two-way interactions are the same. They don't depend on traffic condition. So here there is not a three-way interaction because the two-way interaction of driver's age and cell phone use doesn't depend on traffic condition. So you could really just average across or collapse across and say, hey, we tested people in light traffic and heavy traffic, and whether or not they drove in light traffic or heavy traffic, we got the exact same effect where we got this crossover interaction in both cases. So there's not a three-way interaction. What about here? Crossover interaction, but look closely. The nature of the crossover interaction is completely different depending on if we're talking about light traffic or heavy traffic. So in light traffic, it's the exact same shape of the interaction that we saw before, but in heavy traffic, we've got older drivers that are slower to brake than younger drivers when talking on the cell phone, but older drivers actually being quicker to brake than younger drivers when not on the cell phone. So the nature of the two-way interaction is different and depends on the level of the third variable, which is traffic condition. So we would have a three-way interaction there. All right, again, why worry about all of these interactions? When researchers use a factorial design, they're typically interested in the interaction because they're interested in establishing, does the combination of variables depend on, does the phenomenon depend on a combination of variables? Or we're looking for an effect, does it generalize from one setting to another? Like we think that there's an interaction between using a cell phone and driver's age, but does that depend on whether people are driving in light traffic versus heavy traffic? So the main effects are typically of less concern than the interactions. I would say, of course, it's interesting to know that in heavy traffic, people brake slower. When using a cell phone, overall, people brake slower. But when there is an interaction, those main effects, there's a caveat to it. It's qualified. You would have to say something along the lines of, well, yeah, it's generally true that when using a cell phone, people are slower to brake, but that really depends on whether we're talking about an older driver or a younger driver. Because younger drivers, they brake at the same speed when they're talking on a cell phone versus not, as long as we're talking about light traffic. So it's a much more complicated and nuanced explanation, and it's really the interaction that captures that, not the main effect. Okay, this is just a review, but what to look for when reading a research paper is you're going to read the method section, and that's going to describe the design of the study with the factorial notation being IV1, IV2, IV3. Okay, so the levels of the IVs separated by these multiplication or times. Okay, the other thing that you're going to look for in a results section is to be able to pick out whether the main effects and the interactions are significant. So you should look for statements that reference significant. You should look for things that reference a p-value, so that magic p less than 0.05 will tell you the statistical significance of a main effect or an interaction. You should also be looking for an analysis called a MANOVA, which is a multivariate analysis of variance. And then, of course, just our F statistic or our F ratio. Main effects and interactions in factorial designs are tested with different, we'll just say different types of analysis of variance, but the statistic that is reported is the F. So really when you're reading the results of a factorial study, you're looking for whether the F ratio is statistically significant, and that will indicate whether there is a significant main effect or interaction. I would say that when there is a interaction, the interactions are of primary interest because they will qualify the main effects. Okay, if that makes sense. Okay, the other thing to look for, less so in a peer-reviewed academic paper, but more so in a popular press article, is to look for language along the lines of it depends or only when. Okay, and then to look for participant variables like age or gender or ethnicity, because these participant variables might moderate the effects of another IV. Okay, so really when we're talking about interaction, we're talking about moderator variables that the we can think about traffic condition as being a moderator of the effect of cell phone use and driver's age on braking time. That is, it changes or adjusts the relationship. And so oftentimes moderator variables are participant variables because researchers want to test the generality of effects and say, hey, does the effect of using a cell phone depend on driver's age? Does the effect of quality of a resume in terms of getting hired depend on one's gender? Does the relationship between SAT scores and GPA depend on the ethnicity of the student? So these are really participant variables that would be moderators of effects, and these would signal whether a factorial design has been used. Okay, that's it for this lecture. Hopefully that helps you understand better some of these more complicated factorial designs, including between groups, within groups, and mixed designs, adding different levels to IVs, and then all the different types of research questions as well as effects that can be picked out when adding additional independent variables to a research design, like adding a third independent variable to create a three-way design.